They called it the Panzerfriedhof, the tank graveyard. On the scorched plains of Kursk, where wheat fields once swayed in summer breezes, a grotesque metal cemetery now stretched as far as the eye could see. Blackened hulks of German Tigers and Panthers lay frozen in their final moments, turrets blown clean off, chassis split open like gutted fish. Among them, dozens of Soviet T-34s remained equally still, their angular forms punctured and burning. The stench of diesel fuel, cordite, and death hung heavy in the July heat. For the German soldiers who survived the largest tank battle in human history, this apocalyptic landscape would forever haunt their memories, a monument to miscalculation, courage, and the crushing weight of industrial warfare on an unprecedented scale. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. Dawn broke over the Russian steppe on July 5, 1943. The air was already warm, promising another scorching summer day. Along a 200-mile front curving around the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the eastern front protruding westward into German-held territory, hundreds of thousands of men stirred in their positions. Among them was Oberfeldwebel, Sergeant First Class, Karl Weiss of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. At 23 years old, he was already a veteran of 3 years of war, having fought from France through to the gates of Moscow and the brutal winter retreat of 1941. Now, as commander of a Tiger tank, he was about to participate in Operation Citadel, what the German High Command envisioned as a battle that would reverse their fortunes on the Eastern Front. "We knew this would be different," Weiss later wrote in his memoir. "The waiting had gone on for months. The Russians knew we were coming. We knew they knew." It was like two boxers circling each other, both waiting for the moment to strike, both knowing exactly what the other intended. What made Kursk unique was this terrible transparency. Originally planned for May, Operation Citadel had been repeatedly delayed as Hitler demanded more and more of Germany's latest tanks, the formidable Tigers and new Panthers, be committed to the battle. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare, transforming the Kursk salient into possibly the most heavily defended piece of land in military history. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had ordered the construction of 8 defensive belts, some extending 110 miles deep. Over 400,000 civilians had been mobilized to dig 3,000 miles of trenches, plant 400,000 mines, and construct countless bunkers, gun positions, and anti-tank ditches. The Red Army had positioned nearly 20,000 artillery pieces, one gun every 13 feet along some sectors of the front. Behind these defenses waited 3,600 tanks and 1.3 million Soviet soldiers. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, had argued for immediate action in May before these defenses could be completed. "Every day we delay gives the Russians more time to dig in," he had told Hitler at the Wolfschanze, Wolf's Lair headquarters. But Hitler, enthralled by the promise of his new weapons, particularly the massive Ferdinand tank destroyers with their 80mm guns, had been adamant. "When we attack, we must use our best weapons in overwhelming numbers," he insisted. By July, the Germans had amassed their own formidable force, 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and 10,000 artillery pieces. The plan was for a classic pincer movement. General Walter Model's 9th Army would attack from the north, while Manstein's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf struck from the south. Their objective: to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the salient, repeating the great encirclement battles of 1941 that had captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. In the pre-dawn hours of July 5th, Karl Weiss and his crew performed their final checks on their Tiger tank. The massive 56-ton vehicle was the pride of the German armored forces, with its virtually impenetrable frontal armor and devastating 88mm gun. Each Tiger cost as much to produce as 4 Panzerwehrfeuers, the standard German tank. Though only 1,147 Tigers would be built during the entire war, their psychological impact was enormous on both their enemies and the German soldiers who believed in their invincibility. The Tiger gave us confidence, Weiss recalled. We had seen what Russian T-34s did to our Panzer IIIs and IVs in 41 and 42. Now we had something that could stop them cold at 2,000 meters, while they couldn't penetrate our frontal armor even at point-blank range. This confidence was shared by many in the German High Command. General Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, had told Hitler, "These new weapons will restore our superiority on the battlefield." Hitler himself had proclaimed that the offensive would shine like a beacon around the world, a decisive blow that would demonstrate Germany's continued ability to take the initiative despite the defeats at Stalingrad and North Africa. At Oettrinard, the quiet of the steppe was shattered as German artillery opened fire along the entire front. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, shells screaming overhead to crash into the Soviet positions. When it lifted, the first waves of German infantry moved forward, probing for gaps and clearing paths through the dense minefields for the tanks to follow. "The earth shook beneath us," wrote Lieutenant Pavel Alexeyev of the Soviet 307th Rifle Division. "The German barrage was like nothing I had experienced before, but we stayed in our bunkers, as ordered. General Rokossovsky had been clear, let them enter our web. We were not to engage them at the outset, but to draw them deep into our defenses. This was indeed the Soviet strategy. Rather than try to halt the Germans at the front line, where they could bring their superior tactical ability to bear, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, commanding the Soviet Central Front, planned to exhaust the Germans in layer after layer of defensive positions. It was not territory the Soviets were defending, but time for their massive reserves to prepare for a counterattack that would come after the Germans had spent their offensive strength. By 04:30, the first German tanks began to advance. Among them was Weiss's Tiger, part of a company of 5 Tigers leading a battalion of Panzerwehrfeuers. "We moved slowly at first," Weiss recalled. "The minefields were our biggest concern. A Tiger could withstand a mine blast, but it could throw a track, and a stationary Tiger was a vulnerable Tiger." Explosive charges carried by combat engineers and specialized mine-clearing vehicles created paths through the Soviet minefields. Progress was agonizingly slow. By midday, some German units had advanced only 4 kilometers into the Soviet defenses. Worse, the narrowness of the cleared paths created bottlenecks, forcing tanks to advance in columns rather than the broad formations they preferred. "It was like threading a needle," wrote Hauptmann Captain Wilhelm Schneider of the 6th Panzer Division. "Our Tigers and Panthers were being forced into single file. The Russians had their anti-tank guns positioned to fire down these lanes. They weren't trying to stop us entirely, just slow us, channel us, make us expend ammunition and fuel." By mid-afternoon, the battle had evolved into hundreds of smaller engagements as German tank units encountered Soviet strong points. The new German tanks proved their worth initially. A single Tiger could engage multiple T-34s at ranges where the Soviet tanks couldn't effectively return fire. Oberleutnant First Lieutenant Franz Backe, commanding a heavy tank company in the 13th Panzer Regiment, described one such encounter. "We spotted a group of T-34s, perhaps 10 or 12, advancing toward a position held by our infantry. We were on elevated ground, about 1,800 meters away. They hadn't seen us. I ordered my Tigers to open fire, and within minutes we had knocked out 8 T-34s without taking a single hit in return. The others retreated behind a rise. But the Soviets had anticipated this disparity in firepower. Their defense was built around anti-tank guns, thousands of them, rather than tank versus tank engagements. The 57mm ZIS-2 and 76.2mm ZIS-3 anti-tank guns were small, easily camouflaged, and could be rapidly repositioned. While they struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of Tigers at long range, they could target tracks, wheels, and less armored sections. and in sufficient numbers they could overwhelm even the most heavily armored German tanks. By evening of that first day, the northern attack under Model had gained less than 10 kilometers in most sectors, far below expectations. In the south, Manstein's forces had made somewhat better progress, with the Tajub SS Panzer Corps advancing up to 15 kilometers in some areas. But the cost had been severe, hundreds of tanks damaged or destroyed, thousands of men killed or wounded. Feldwebel Sergeant Ernst Barkmann, a tank commander in the 2nd SS Panzer Division, later described the scene. The battlefield was like something from another world, burning tanks everywhere, ours and theirs, the wounded screaming for medics, destroyed anti-tank guns with their crews scattered around them, and always the dust and smoke, making it impossible to see more than a few dozen meters ahead. Communication was breaking down. Units became separated. It was chaos. What concerned the German commanders most was that they had yet to encounter the main Soviet tank forces. The resistance thus far had come primarily from infantry, artillery, and anti-tank units. The vast Soviet tank armies, including the 5th Guards Tank Army under General Pavel Rotmistrov, remained uncommitted, waiting in reserve. Field Marshal von Manstein, directing the southern pincer from his headquarters near Belgorod, received increasingly concerning reports throughout the day. The new Panther tanks, rushed into production for this offensive, were experiencing serious mechanical problems. Nearly half had broken down before even encountering the enemy. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, while nearly impervious to Soviet guns from the front, proved to have significant vulnerabilities. They lacked machine guns to protect against infantry attacks, and their enormous weight made them difficult to recover when damaged. "We are not advancing quickly enough," Manstein told his staff that evening. "We must break through their main defensive belt tomorrow, or this offensive will fail." July 6th brought more of the same, incremental advances, heavy losses, and the growing realization that the element of surprise, so critical to previous German successes, was entirely absent at Kursk. The Soviets had predicted not just the location of the attack, but its timing and methods. Each kilometer of advance brought the Germans against fresh Soviet defenses, pre-registered artillery, and more minefields. For the individual German tanker, the experience was one of constant tension. Günter Becker, a gunner in a Panzer IV, described it. "You never knew where the next shot would come from. The Russians were masters of camouflage. An anti-tank gun would fire once, twice, and then the crew would abandon it before we could return effective fire. Their infantry would crawl right up to our tanks with explosive charges. We lost 3 tanks in my company to infantry attacks alone." The heat added to the misery. Inside the steel confines of a tank, temperatures could reach 50 degrees, 120°. Crews fought not just the enemy but exhaustion, dehydration, and the noise and concussion of combat. "After the first day, my ears were bleeding," one Panther driver reported. "The noise inside was beyond description. Our own gun firing, shells hitting our armor, the engine roaring. We couldn't hear commands over the radio. We resorted to hand signals inside the tank." By July 7th, the 3rd day of the battle, the advance had slowed to a crawl. In the north, Model's 9th Army was already on the defensive in some sectors as Soviet counterattacks began to threaten their flanks. In the south, Manstein's forces had made more progress but were still far from achieving the breakthrough needed to encircle the Soviet forces. The terrain itself became an enemy. The summer heat had dried the ground and hundreds of tanks churned the earth into a fine dust that hung in the air, reducing visibility to meters. Tanks and vehicles overheated, air filters clogged, the few available roads became choked with disabled vehicles. "We couldn't see the enemy until they were right on top of us," wrote Unteroffizier Corporal Heinz Schröder of the 3rd Panzer Division. "The dust was so thick it was like driving into a wall. We'd hear explosions, see the flash of gunfire, but couldn't locate the source before it was too late." July 8th marked a turning point. With the German offensive clearly stalling, Soviet Marshal Zhukov decided it was time to commit his reserves. The 5th Guards Tank Army began moving toward Prokhorovka, a small railway town that had become the focal point of the southern German attack. Rotmistrov's army included over 650 tanks, mostly T-34s, but also some of the new heavy KV-1s and KV-2s. They would meet the advancing the two SS Panzer Corps, comprising the elite Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, the best equipped and most fanatically dedicated units in the German army. For Karl Weiss and his Tiger crew, July 9th of 11th brought a change in the pattern of battle. We began encountering more and more Soviet tanks, rather than just anti-tank guns and infantry, he recorded. The T-34 was a formidable opponent, fast, with a good gun and sloped armor that could deflect shells. But our 88 could penetrate it at ranges over 1,500 meters, while they had to get much closer to damage us. This advantage in range and firepower allowed the German tanks to fight their preferred battle, engagement at distance, where their superior optics, gun stabilization, and armor could dominate. But the Soviets rarely obliged. Soviet tank commanders sought close engagements, where their numerical advantage and the T-34's superior mobility could be brought to bear. They would come at us out of the dust and smoke, sometimes only 100 meters away, Weiss wrote. At that range, even a T-34's 76mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's side armor. We lost 2 Tigers in our company this way. They simply couldn't traverse their turrets quickly enough to track the faster Soviet tanks circling them. By July 11th, the Tegnon SS Panzer Corps was approaching Prokhorovka from the south. To their west, the 3rd Panzer Corps was making a parallel advance. Between them lay a corridor that, if closed, would trap significant Soviet forces. It was precisely this threat that had prompted Zhukov to commit Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army. The night of July 11th was tense for both sides. German reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the massive Soviet tank force moving into position. Luftwaffe attacks had harassed their advance, but failed to significantly delay them. The Soviet tankers, many driving for nearly 24 hours straight to reach the battlefield, prepared their vehicles for what they knew would be a decisive engagement. Rotmistrov gathered his commanders and outlined a simple but audacious plan. Rather than establish defensive positions, the 5th Guards Tank Army would launch an all-out offensive at dawn, catching the Germans as they themselves were preparing to attack. "We will not give them time to deploy," he told his officers. "We will close to short range immediately and use our numbers to overwhelm them." On the German side, SS Oberfuhrer Senior Colonel Max Winsche, commanding a regiment of the Leibstandarte Division, sensed the impending clash. "The Russians are clearly massing for a significant counterattack," he reported to divisional headquarters. "We should expect a major tank engagement tomorrow." Throughout the night, both sides moved into position. The battlefield around Prokhorovka was ideal for neither side. Rolling hills, gullies, and small woods broke up the terrain, limiting the long-range advantage of the German tanks, but also constraining the mass maneuvers preferred by the Soviets. A railway embankment bisected the field, creating both an obstacle and a potential defensive position. As dawn broke on July 12th, a date that would become legendary in the history of armored warfare, the two forces prepared for battle in very different ways. The German tankers methodically checked their vehicles, carefully plotted firing positions, and established a defensive line with interlocking fields of fire. The Soviet preparation was more hurried but no less purposeful. Tanks topped off with fuel, ammunition replenished, and simple orders given: advance rapidly, close with the enemy, and destroy them at short range. At 06:30, as a low morning mist still hung over the fields, the Soviet artillery opened fire with a massive barrage. Thousands of guns, rocket launchers, and mortars created a wall of fire and steel that swept across the German positions. Under this covering fire, the first echelon of Soviet tanks began to move forward. Hauptsturmführer Captain Michael Wittmann, a Tiger commander who would later become one of Germany's most decorated tank aces, described the moment. The ground trembled. Through my periscope, I could see them coming, wave after wave of T-34s emerging from the mist and smoke. There seemed to be no end to them. I ordered my gunner to hold fire until they reached 800 meters. We needed every shot to count. What followed was what many participants would later describe as a tank stampede. Rather than the ordered, methodical battle that German doctrine envisioned, Prokhorovka devolved into a swirling, chaotic melee of armor. Soviet T-34s charged directly at the German positions, often at full speed. The flat trajectory and high velocity of the German 80mm guns actually became a disadvantage at close range, as shots that would have been direct hits at distance now passed over the low-profile Soviet tanks. It was butcher's work, recalled SS Unterscharführer Sergeant Josef Frankel, a Panther gunner. They were all around us. I'd traverse the turret to engage one T-34, only to have another appear on our flank. Our commander was shouting targets so quickly we could barely keep up. The inside of the tank was filled with smoke from our own gun, making it nearly impossible to see through the sights. The Soviet tactics, while costly, achieved their purpose. By sacrificing tanks to close the distance, they negated much of the German qualitative advantage. A Tiger might destroy 5 T-34s at range, but if a sixth got close enough to fire into its vulnerable rear or flank, the exchange became equal. Karl Weiss's Tiger was in the center of this maelstrom. "We fired until our gun barrel was glowing red-hot," he wrote. "I counted 14 confirmed kills by mid-morning, but they kept coming. We were running low on ammunition, and our engine was overheating from running continuously for hours. Then we took a hit to our left track from a T-34 that seemed to appear from nowhere, barely 50 meters away. We were immobilized. A disabled tank was vulnerable, and Weiss knew it. I ordered the crew to keep firing as long as possible. We destroyed the T-34 that had hit us, and 2 more that approached. But then our main gun jammed. The breech block expanded from the heat and wouldn't close properly. We had only our machine guns left. What saved Weiss and his crew was the arrival of German infantry with handheld anti-tank weapons, who established a perimeter around the stricken Tiger. Even so, the situation was dire. Through my vision blocks, I could see nothing but smoke, fire, and the shapes of tanks, both ours and Soviet, moving like dark ghosts through the chaos. The noise was indescribable, engines roaring, guns firing, shells impacting, men shouting and screaming. By midday, the battle had reached its crescendo. Across a front of less than 3 kilometers, nearly 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns were engaged in close combat. The fields around Prokhorovka became a vision of industrial warfare at its most intense, a hurricane of steel in which machines weighing dozens of tons crashed into each other like jousting knights, fired at point-blank range, and even, in some documented cases, resorted to ramming when ammunition was exhausted. The human cost was severe. When tanks were hit, crews often had little chance of escape. The Soviet T-34 was particularly vulnerable to catastrophic ammunition explosions. Its shells were stored around the turret ring, and a penetrating hit often caused them to detonate, blowing the turret completely off the tank and killing all inside instantly. The German tanks, with their larger internal volume, offered somewhat better survivability, but a penetrating hit that reached the ammunition storage or fuel tanks was usually fatal. You tried not to think about what was happening to the crews of the tanks you hit, one German gunner later admitted. You'd see the flash as your shell penetrated, sometimes the turret flying off, and you knew that 3 or 4 men had just died horribly. But if you dwelled on that, you couldn't function. So you moved on to the next target, and the next. The losses on both sides were staggering. By day's end, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army had lost over 400 tanks. The Citadel SS Panzer Corps lost fewer vehicles, perhaps 80 tanks and assault guns destroyed outright, but had many more damaged. The numbers, however, tell only part of the story. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. Germany increasingly could not. As evening approached, the intensity of the fighting began to diminish. Exhausted crews, low on ammunition and fuel, pulled back to resupply. The battlefield was left strewn with hundreds of burning or destroyed tanks. The wounded and dying lay among the wrecks, their cries adding a human counterpoint to the mechanical destruction around them. Both sides claimed victory at Prokhorovka. The Soviets pointed to their success in halting the German advance. The Germans highlighted the disproportionate losses they had inflicted. In truth, it was a tactical stalemate, but a strategic Soviet success. The German offensive had been stopped, and with it, the last major German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. For Karl Weiss, the aftermath of the battle brought a personal reckoning. Our Tiger was recovered that night by a recovery vehicle. The damage was repairable, and we were back in action 3 days later. But something had changed. The myth of invincibility was gone. We had seen too many invincible Tigers burning alongside the T-34s they had destroyed. The arithmetic of the war was becoming clear. They could lose 5 tanks for every one of ours, and still win in the end. The greater strategic picture was already changing dramatically, even as the smoke cleared over Prokhorovka. On July 10th, while Operation Citadel was still in full swing, Allied forces had landed in Sicily, opening a new front in the Mediterranean that threatened Italy, Germany's primary European ally. This development created an immediate strategic dilemma for Hitler and the German High Command. On July 13th, the day after the tank battle at Prokhorovka, Hitler summoned Field Marshals von Manstein and Klug to his headquarters. The meeting was tense. Manstein argued forcefully for continuing the offensive in the southern sector, where his forces had made the most progress. "We have broken through their main defensive lines," he insisted. "One more push, and we can achieve our objectives." But Hitler's mind was elsewhere. The threat of Allied landings in Italy itself and the political ramifications of Italy's potential defection from the Axis had become his overriding concern. "We must transfer forces to the Mediterranean," he told his commanders. "Operation Citadel will be halted." Manstein was furious. "You cannot throw away the sacrifice of so many men and so much material," he protested. "Let us at least secure what we have gained." But Hitler was adamant. Units from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, the very forces that had fought at Prokhorovka, were ordered to prepare for immediate transfer to Italy. For the German soldiers on the ground, the order to halt the offensive came as a bewildering blow. "We couldn't understand it," wrote Oberleutnant Hans Grohmann of the 7th Panzer Division. "We had suffered, bled, lost friends and comrades. For what? To advance 30 kilometers and then simply stop and give it all back? It made no sense to us." It made perfect strategic sense to the Soviet High Command, however. Marshal Zhukov had anticipated this very outcome. The defensive phase of the battle had achieved its primary objective, exhausting the German offensive capacity without yielding decisive ground. Now the Soviets were ready to launch the second phase of their plan, a massive counteroffensive aimed not just at reclaiming the territory lost during Citadel, but at pushing the Germans back across a broad front. On July 15th, the Soviet Bryansk front launched Operation Kutuzov, striking at the northern face of the Kursk salient. 3 days later, the southwestern and southern fronts began Operation Rumyantsev against the southern sector. Weakened by their losses during Citadel and with key units being withdrawn for redeployment to Italy, the German forces had little choice but to retreat. For Karl Weiss and his Tiger crew, the sudden shift from offense to defense created a new and even more challenging reality. "We went from hunters to hunted in the space of a few days," he recorded. "Suddenly we were facing not just the forces that had stopped us at Prokhorovka, but fresh Soviet tank armies arriving from their strategic reserves. Our fuel was rationed, our ammunition limited. We were ordered to prioritize the defense of key transportation hubs and withdrawal routes." The Soviet summer offensive of 1943 was fundamentally different from previous operations. Gone were the massive but disorganized human wave attacks of 1941 and 1942. The Red Army that pursued the retreating Germans was a more mature fighting force, with improved tactics, better trained officers, and a clear understanding of its own strengths and weaknesses. Soviet General Pavel Rotmistrov, whose 5th Guards Tank Army had been so crucial at Prokhorovka, described this evolution. We learned from our enemies. The Germans taught us the value of concentrated armor, of operational depth, of communication and coordination. But we adapted these lessons to our own situation, our own resources. We developed our own doctrine of deep battle that matched our industrial capacity and manpower advantages. This maturation of Soviet military capability was evident to the Germans now facing it. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schneider, whose panzer unit was covering the withdrawal from Belgorod, noted, "Their artillery coordination was excellent, much better than in previous years. Their tanks operated in conjunction with infantry, not separately. Even their air support had improved dramatically. They were not the same army we had faced in 1941. By early August, the Germans had been pushed back to the positions they had held before Operation Citadel began. The cost had been enormous. The Germans lost over 720 tanks and assault guns, 680 aircraft, and suffered nearly 170,000 casualties they could ill afford. The Soviets, while losing more equipment and men in absolute terms, had showcased their ability to absorb such losses and continue advancing, a capacity the Germans no longer possessed. The immediate military consequences of Kursk were significant. The strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had permanently passed to the Soviet Union. The myth of German technical and tactical superiority had been severely undermined. And perhaps most importantly, the German panzer forces, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, had been so depleted that they could never again mount a strategic offensive in the East. But beyond these operational outcomes, Kursk represented a psychological turning point for the German soldiers who experienced it. This was particularly true for the tank crews who had been at the center of the battle. Before Kursk, despite the setback at Stalingrad, many of us still believed in final victory, wrote Tiger Commander Franz Beck. After Kursk, that belief became harder to maintain. We had thrown our best equipment, our elite units, against the Russians, and failed. What more could we do? For ordinary German tank crewmen, the battle brought a new and uncomfortable awareness of their own vulnerability. The Tiger tank, which many had viewed as nearly invincible, had shown its limitations. It was formidable, but not decisive. It could be disabled by mines, immobilized by artillery, flanked by faster Soviet tanks, or simply overwhelmed by superior numbers. The psychological effect of seeing burning Tigers was profound, recalled Feldwebel Erich Heine of the 1st SS Panzer Division. These were supposed to be our wonder weapons, our answer to the T-34. When you saw them being destroyed alongside the Panzer Reifries and Panthers, it shook your confidence not just in the equipment, but in the entire narrative we had been told about the war. This disillusionment was compounded by what many German tankers perceived as a failure of leadership. The constant delays to Operation Citadel, Hitler's abrupt cancellation of the offensive just as Manstein believed a breakthrough was possible, and the subsequent retreat all contributed to a sense that the strategic direction of the war was flawed. "We did our duty," one Panther commander wrote home after the battle. "We destroyed many enemy tanks, held our positions until ordered to withdraw. But for what purpose? What greater strategy are we serving?" These questions remained unanswered, and this uncertainty affects morale more than any hardship or danger. For Soviet tankers, by contrast, Kursk represented a validation. Their equipment, while individually less sophisticated than the latest German tanks, had proven sufficient when properly employed. Their tactics, particularly the willingness to close to short range to negate German advantages, had been effective if costly, and their industrial capacity had demonstrated its ability to replace losses that would have been crippling to their opponents. After Prokhorovka, we knew we could defeat the fascist tanks, declared T-34 Commander Lieutenant Dmitry Lelyushenko. Yes, their Tigers were powerful. Yes, we lost many vehicles and brave comrades, but we stopped them, and then we drove them back. The correlation of forces had shifted, decisively in our favor. This shift was not merely a matter of numbers or equipment. It reflected a deeper transformation in how the war on the Eastern Front was understood by those fighting it. For the Germans, Kursk marked the point at which many accepted, privately, if not publicly, that the war was ultimately unwinnable. For the Soviets, it confirmed their ability not just to resist the German war machine, but to defeat it decisively and drive it westward, all the way to Berlin. The human dimension of this turning point is captured in the contrasting experiences of two tank commanders in the weeks following the battle. Karl Weiss, having survived Prokhorovka with a damaged but repairable Tiger, found himself in nearly continuous combat as the Soviet counteroffensive gained momentum. We would establish a defensive position, engage advancing Soviet forces until ordered to withdraw, then fall back to the next position, he wrote. Each time, we had less fuel, less ammunition, fewer supporting infantry. We knew we were just buying time for the main force to establish more defensible lines to the west. During one such delaying action near Bogodukov on August, Weiss's Tiger was hit by several 76mm shells that, while failing to penetrate the frontal armor, damaged the gun mantlet and wounded his gunner. Low on fuel and with a partially disabled main gun, Weiss made the difficult decision to abandon the tank during the night withdrawal. Leaving that Tiger was like leaving a comrade behind, he recorded. We had survived so much together, but the harsh arithmetic of war had caught up with us. We didn't have the recovery vehicles, spare parts, or time needed to save it. We destroyed the gun mechanism and radio, then joined the infantry retreat on foot. Weiss and his surviving crew were eventually assigned to a new Tiger, but the experience of abandoning functional equipment due to logistical constraints was a profound illustration of Germany's deteriorating situation. In 1941, we would have had repair teams forward, fuel depots within reach, air cover above, Weiss observed. By August 1943, we had none of these things. We were not just fighting the Russians, but our own increasing material limitations. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, T-34 Commander Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Popov had experienced Kursk as a validation of the Red Army's growing prowess. Having survived the defensive phase of the battle in the central sector, his tank battalion was now part of the Soviet forces pushing westward. We received new T-34-76 tanks directly from the factory in Nizhny Tagil, Popov noted in his report. They arrived by rail, sometimes still with manufacturing grease on the components. Our maintenance crews would perform final preparations, and within hours, these tanks would be in combat. The contrast with 1941, when we had to husband every vehicle, could not have been more stark. This abundance of equipment was accompanied by increased tactical sophistication. Our coordination with artillery, infantry, and air support improved with each operation, Popov observed. We had learned to identify and target the German Panthers and Tigers first, using multiple T-34s to flank them while they were engaged frontally. Our losses remained high, but they were now purposeful losses that achieved specific objectives. These diverging experiences, one of increasing constraint, the other of expanding capability, encapsulated the broader trajectory of the war after Kursk. The battle had not just consumed vast quantities of men and material, it had fundamentally altered the psychological and operational dynamics of the Eastern Front. The German High Command recognized this shift even as they struggled to address it. In a meeting at Führer headquarters on August 13th, General Heinz Guderian, who had recently been appointed Inspector General of Armored Troops, presented Hitler with a stark assessment. The ratio of our tank production to that of the Russians is approximately 1:6. Even with superior quality, we cannot sustain losses at the rate experienced at Kursk. Hitler's response was characteristic, a combination of denial and promises of technological solutions. The new Tiger II and Panther II will restore the balance, he insisted, and our new tank destroyers will multiply our defensive capability. But for the officers who had seen the reality at Kursk, these promises rang increasingly hollow. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond the Eastern Front. The transfer of the 2 SS Panzer Corps to Italy, units that might have made the difference at Kursk had they remained, failed to prevent Italy's surrender to the Allies on September 8, 1943. Though German forces would occupy much of Italy and continue fighting there for nearly 2 more years, another front had been irreversibly opened, further stretching Germany's dwindling resources. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Kursk validated Stalin's strategy of allowing the Germans to exhaust themselves against prepared defenses before launching counteroffensives with fresh reserves. This approach would be refined and repeated in future operations, contributing significantly to Soviet success in the latter stages of the war. The battle also solidified the reputation of several Soviet commanders who would lead the Red Army to ultimate victory. Zhukov and Vasilevsky, the architects of the defensive plan, Rokossovsky and Vatutin, who commanded the fronts directly engaged at Kursk, Rotmistrov, whose 5th Guards Tank Army had been so crucial at Prokhorovka, all emerged from the battle with enhanced prestige and influence. For the individual tank crews who had faced each other across the scorched fields of Kursk, the battle left indelible memories and lessons that would shape their understanding of the rest of the war. After Kursk, we never looked at a T-34 the same way again, wrote Panther gunner Josef Frankel. Earlier in the war, we had sometimes dismissed them as crude, mass-produced machines inferior to our own tanks. Kursk taught us respect, not just for the machine, but for the men who operated it with such determination and, increasingly, skill. This respect was often mutual. The German tanks were technically superior in many ways, acknowledged Soviet T-34 commander Mikhail Borisov. Their optical systems, radios, gun stabilization, all were better than ours. But a tank is more than its specifications. It is a system that includes the crew, the tactics, the supply chain, the recovery and repair capacity. In this broader sense, the T-34 proved itself the superior weapon system at Kursk. As summer gave way to autumn in 1943, the Eastern Front continued to move westward. The Germans established a series of defensive lines, but each was eventually breached by Soviet offensives. Kiev was liberated on November 6th. By the end of the year, the Red Army had reclaimed more than half the territory lost in 1941-42. For Karl Weiss, the rest of 1943 brought a series of desperate defensive actions. His new Tiger, received in late August, was one of the last available as production struggled to replace losses. "We became mobile anti-tank guns more than offensive weapons," he noted. "Our orders were to engage Soviet armor at maximum range, disrupt their advances, then withdraw before they could bring their full weight to bear." We never again experienced the confidence of the pre-Kursk period. In December 1943, during the Soviet offensive toward Zhytomyr, Weiss's Tiger was hit multiple times by artillery fire while supporting an infantry counterattack. Though the armor was not penetrated, the suspension was damaged beyond field repair. With Soviet forces closing in and no recovery vehicles available, the crew was forced once again to abandon their tank after removing essential equipment. "This time, we placed demolition charges in the turret and engine compartment," Weiss recorded. "We could not risk leaving a Tiger to be captured intact. As we withdrew through the forest, we heard the explosion that destroyed our tank." For me, that explosion also marked the end of a chapter. I had believed in the Tiger as the answer to the T-34. Now I understood that no single weapon, however formidable, could alter the fundamental equation of the war. Weiss would survive to fight in a third Tiger tank during the desperate defense of Poland and East Prussia in 1944-45. Captured by Soviet forces near Königsberg in April 1945, he spent 5 years in Soviet prisoner-of-war camps before returning to Germany in 1950. His memoir, Tiger Heart, A German Tanker's War on the Eastern Front, published in 1957, became one of the most insightful first-hand accounts of armored warfare from the German perspective. The experience of Soviet tankers like Nikolai Popov followed a very different trajectory. After Kursk, the T-34 was progressively upgraded, most significantly with an 85 mm gun that gave it greater parity with German Panthers. Production continued to increase, and by 1944, Soviet tank crews were receiving improved training, better equipment, and more comprehensive tactical doctrine. The fear we had felt in 1941 and 1942, when facing superior German tanks with inadequate weapons, had been replaced by confidence, Popov wrote after the war. Not overconfidence, we still respected the capability of Tigers and Panthers to destroy us at long range. But we now had the numbers, the equipment, and the tactics to overcome these advantages. Popov would participate in Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive in June 1944 that destroyed German Army Group Center and advanced the front to the gates of Warsaw. His T-34-85 was knocked out during fighting near Minsk, but he survived and was given command of a new tank within days, an experience that highlighted the continuing Soviet advantage in replacement capacity. The long-term impact of Kursk extended well beyond the immediate military outcomes. For the German army, the battle represented the end of an era, the final failed attempt to win the war in the east through offensive operations. After Kursk, German strategy became increasingly reactive, focused on defense and delay rather than victory. This shift was particularly profound for the Panzer forces, which had been created and trained primarily for offensive warfare. We had been taught to attack, to exploit breakthroughs, to drive deep into enemy territory, wrote Colonel Hyacinth Graf Strachwitz, a panzer commander who fought at Kursk. After the summer of 1943, we found ourselves in an entirely different war, one of defensive hedgehogs, limited counterattacks, and strategic withdrawal. It was a role for which neither our equipment nor our doctrine had been designed. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht as a whole was similarly significant. Kursk, coming after the disaster at Stalingrad, and the loss of North Africa, confirmed that Germany had lost the strategic initiative on all fronts. While many units would continue to fight with remarkable determination and effectiveness, the sense of purpose that had animated the earlier campaigns was increasingly replaced by a fatalistic commitment to duty and, ultimately, simple survival. For the Soviet Union, Kursk marked the confirmation of a strategic transformation. The Red Army that emerged from the summer of 1943 was not just larger and better equipped than its 1941 predecessor. It was qualitatively different, more professional, more confident, and more sophisticated in its operational art. This transformation would be further refined in the great offensives of 1944-45 that carried Soviet forces to Berlin. But its foundations were laid in the defensive preparations and subsequent counteroffensives at Kursk, where the Red Army demonstrated its ability not just to absorb the best that the Wehrmacht could deliver, but to respond with overwhelming force. The technical and doctrinal lessons of Kursk were studied intensively by both sides and would influence armored warfare long after the war ended. The Germans, recognizing the limitations of even their most powerful tanks when faced with overwhelming numbers, accelerated development of tank destroyers, specialized anti-tank vehicles with heavy guns but limited mobility. The Jagdtiger and Jagdpanther were direct responses to the experience at Kursk, where the need to engage multiple targets at long range had become paramount. The Soviets, meanwhile, continued to refine their approach of quantity with sufficient quality. The T-34-85, introduced in early 1944, addressed the main armament deficiency of the T-34-76 while maintaining the tank's excellent mobility and ease of production. Soviet industrial capacity ensured that these improved tanks could be produced in numbers that dwarfed German output. Perhaps most significantly, both sides recognized the increasing importance of combined arms operations. Tanks alone, no matter how powerful, were vulnerable without adequate infantry, artillery, and air support. The complex defensive system created by the Soviets at Kursk, integrating all these elements, became a model for future operations. The human cost of the Battle of Kursk defies easy comprehension. Official figures indicate that the Soviets lost approximately 177,000 men killed, missing, or captured, with perhaps 500,000 wounded. German casualties are harder to determine precisely, but likely exceeded 50,000 killed and 100,000 wounded. Behind these statistics lie countless individual tragedies, families shattered, futures erased, potential unfulfilled. The material losses were similarly staggering. Between them, the two sides lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns, 1,000 aircraft, and thousands of artillery pieces and other vehicles. Much of this equipment represented the most advanced technology of the time, the product of intensive industrial effort and engineering skill, reduced to twisted metal on the Russian steppe. Yet the strategic significance of these losses was asymmetric. For the Soviet Union, with its vast industrial capacity now fully mobilized and operating beyond the reach of German bombers, such losses, while painful, were sustainable. For Germany, already fighting a multi-front war with dwindling resources, they represented an irreplaceable hemorrhage of scarce equipment and irreplaceable trained personnel. This fundamental asymmetry would define the remainder of the war on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht would continue to fight with tactical brilliance and determination, inflicting disproportionate losses on Soviet forces in many engagements. But after Kursk, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the duration and cost of the struggle remained uncertain. For the men who fought at Kursk, both German and Soviet, the battle represented a crucible that tested not just their courage and skill, but their understanding of the war and their place within it. Many German tank crews entered the battle confident in the superiority of their equipment and training, only to encounter a reality that challenged these assumptions. Soviet tankers, having endured the disasters of 1941-42, found at Kursk confirmation of their growing capability and a vindication of their sacrifices. Beyond these military dimensions, Kursk offers enduring lessons about the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. It demonstrated the limitations of qualitative superiority when confronted with overwhelming quantitative advantage. It illustrated the critical importance of strategic depth, operational reserves, and industrial capacity. And it underscored the human factor in warfare, the courage, endurance, and adaptability of the individuals who ultimately determined the outcome. The fields around Prokhorovka, once torn by the tracks of hundreds of tanks and cratered by countless shell explosions, have long since been reclaimed by agriculture. Wheat once again grows where men fought and died. But the legacy of what happened there in July 1943 continues to influence our understanding of modern warfare and the human capacity for both destruction and resilience. For Karl Weiss and his generation of German tankers, Kursk represented both the zenith and the beginning of the end of the panzer force that had once seemed unstoppable. "We entered Russia believing in our invincibility," Weiss wrote in the conclusion of his memoir. At Kursk, that belief died alongside thousands of our comrades. What remained was a grim determination to do our duty as soldiers, even as the strategic situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The tigers still roared, but now it was the roar of cornered beasts, not conquering predators. For Nikolai Popov and his Soviet counterparts, Kursk was the validation of a terrible journey from the near collapse of 1941 to the certainty of ultimate victory. "After Prokhorovka, we knew the fascists could be beaten," he stated in a post-war interview. "Not easily, not without cost, but decisively and completely. The path to Berlin was opened at Kursk, though many battles remained to be fought." Today, the Battle of Kursk stands as a testament to both the destructive capacity of industrial warfare and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such destruction. It reminds us of the terrible cost of conflict and the incalculable value of peace. And it offers a window into a pivotal moment when the course of history turned on the courage, sacrifice, and determination of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, fighting not for abstract ideals, but for survival, duty, and the hope of returning home.